Hi guys, I'm going to talk about the sustain pedal function in MIDI Guitar 2 and how to use it with an expression pedal, or perhaps, as in my case, I use it with my own sustain pedal. But this belongs to my bigger keyboard setup, so this runs straight into my keyboard and then via USB into my MIDI Guitar 2. For any other occasions or for any other setups, you may want to use an expression pedal. Just set it to send CC64. CC64 is normally assigned to any sort of sustain pedal action in most software anyway. Here is what the MIDI Guitar 2 interface looks like. It says interface, and you need to go to the control slot here and choose whatever you're sending your MIDI CC64 on. If I were to have an expression pedal like this, I have a Bluetooth connection on this one, so I may want to send to any Bluetooth receiver that I may hook up to the computer. But in this case, to show you, I changed this to USB MIDI. That's what my keyboard is called in this setup. So now it's hooked up to the keyboard pedal. This should be MIDI CC64, and you should see some action in the pedal in the interface. What I wanted to do is sort of introduce ways of using the sustain pedal that perhaps isn't the first thing you think about when you use sustain pedal. Obviously, you have piano sustain. Go into type of sustain here in MIDI Guitar 2. You have the piano sustain, which is the traditional piano sustain, but then you have something called hold instrument switch to guitar. It's better to think of this just as a hold for the purpose that I'm going to use it as. So this is a hold function, and whatever sort of thing you have ringing already, if it's a chord that you've played just recently and press this, it will hold that chord and you can play something else over that. The way I usually do this is split things up into different channels. So I have one instrument on one channel that I've hooked this up to. So that instrument will be held, and I can keep playing the other instrument on top of that. The other instrument will be unaffected of my pressing the sustain pedal. To explain how to set up for a session like this, I use two audio tracks with the same input. In my case, it's external audio in on one. That's from my audio interface. For each of these audio tracks, I have one instance of MIDI guitar, and I also have a third track here, and that's a MIDI in from my sustain pedal in this case, or my electric piano, which has this sustain pedal connected to it. I'm using the MIDI 2 to decide the destination for that MIDI CC64. The options I have is obviously audio 1 and audio 2. That's the audio tracks that I created for my MIDI Guitar 2 instances. I've also created a sustain pedal for each of these instances of MIDI Guitar 2. So when I choose audio 1 here, the sustain pedal on the first instance of MIDI Guitar 2 will react. I have two different instruments. I have an electric bass and I have an electric piano here. With this setup, I'm of course controlling the piano with the sustain pedal and soloing with the bass over that. So the bass is unaffected by that pressing of the sustain pedal with this setup. I'll switch that around. I can do that here with the destination. I'll just switch that to audio 2 instead, and now the sustain pedal will control the bass instead, and I will solo with the piano. And you can hear, of course, that the sustain pedal works both as a mute and as a hold effect. If I press it before playing, I will effectively mute that other instrument. But if I hold it, if I press it directly after having played something, it will of course hold that. For as long as I'm pressing. So this is mainly how I set up for a patch like this. You'll see some different variations on this theme. Some are a little bit more complex, but all in all, this is mainly how I was set up. To explain the difference between these three types of sustain here, I'm returning to the standalone mode that I was in from the beginning, so I'm skipping the Abelton setup right now. So we have piano sustain, we have this hold instrument, and we have this forward CC64 to instrument, but they all look a bit different on the interfaces of certain instruments. So I'm going to use the Gforce Minimonsta here, so you can see at least the differences in what's happening. And I want you to look at the whole light that is here and how the keys are pressed when I'm pressing the sustain pedal and playing at the same time. So this is the first version here is the MIDI Guitar to piano sustain, and that's somewhat of an artificial sustain. It won't sound any different from sending actual MIDI CC64 to the instrument, but it looks different when you look at it. So I have the pedal pressed, and you can see already that these pressed keys won't let go. So I can do some nice legacy atmosphere stuff with this if I want to, but it's the visual representation in the instrument is a bit different from if I were to forward MIDI CC64 to the instrument. It will sound practically the same, but now I've the third version here, forwarding MIDI CC64 to the instrument, pressing the pedal, but you can see that the keys aren't sort of sticking anymore. And you also see that the whole light here lights up as I press the pedal. Now it's actually getting the real MIDI CC64 from MIDI Guitar here as well. For all practical purposes, there's no real difference if I use this artificial piano sustain. But you can see that there's no light lighting up here, and the keys look a bit different. On the other hand, if I use the hold instrument, it's not at all the same thing as this hold. I can't add anything afterwards. Now I've pressed the sustain pedal. Nothing happens. This is like the hold or freeze function that I've been showing you earlier here. So there might not be a super big difference in how the instrument sounds if you choose the first piano sustain as compared to the third version, but sometimes there are, and for some instruments when you can change how the MIDI CC64 is to react or interact with the instrument, of course there could be some differences there. I can use the actual MIDI CC64 for other purposes with the instrument. So like with this swamp flute I have here, for instance, I've set the MIDI CC64 to control the overblow and the flutter. So can you use anything else than MIDI CC64? Yes, of course you can. This little knob here, it's set on MIDI CC64 to begin with, but setting it on MIDI 66, for instance, I know that I can use my second pedal in my setup here for that, because it's set to send on MIDI CC66 instead. And you can, if you have, say, a volume pedal that's send CC7, for instance, or a foot pedal set to send on MIDI CC4, for instance, you can still use it to forward MIDI CC64 to the instrument. It will be translated here. So it's also a translator from incoming MIDI to that instrument in fact. So looking at the MIDI Guitar software itself, it may look somewhat inconspicuous, but think of it like this. This is one function from the MIDI FX that has all these small variations. I mean, you have 3 types of sustain from this one function, and you also have this translator in this one little function. So I think it's amazing how much stuff they've managed to cram into this little piece of software. So I hope that you'll have some use for the information in these walkthroughs of these smaller functions, because I'll probably come back to another function as soon as I've been digging into that and realizing that I didn't know that much about it either. So till next time, see ya, bye.